I do not think that saturated fat causes chronic disease. Eat the amount of red meat that you like because we do not have evidence to tell you anything to the contrary.
Nina Teicholz, science journalist, researcher, speaker, and best-selling author.
She exposed the low-fat myth and changed how we think about nutrition.
Do you think bacon is healthy for you?
I do. Do you know that bacon is the #1 food that causes people to go off their vegan or vegetarian diets? I mean, there's something so delicious about bacon.
What is the #1 evidence-based approach to fix chronic disease?
It's no question that that is a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet. If you have a metabolic condition, it can also be characterized as a condition of carbohydrate intolerance. Even something like healthy whole grain bread, which you think would be better for you, the moment that you eat it, those starches are just sugar molecules holding hands. One of the things that's very liberating about a ketogenic diet is you do not only not calculate macros, you do not have to count calories.
Is there a connection between the fat that you eat and blood cholesterol?
I can answer that as a robust no. When you eat a lot of cholesterol, your body downregulates its own production and vice versa. Butter, ghee, tallow, lard, that's what humans survived on. That's what we evolved to eat. Give it a try. Like, what do you have to lose?
The medication you're taking was never the answer to your chronic disease, whether you have diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, even insulin resistance. And if you go see your doctor, they're most likely following the guidelines that have been heavily influenced by big food and big pharma. And the agenda is not to fix the root cause of your chronic disease. In most cases, it is to make profit from you and me and everybody else that has a chronic disease. In this episode, my guest, Nina Teicholz, was a former vegetarian who has spent decades understanding these dietary guidelines. And she has a conclusion. We have been lied to. In this episode, Nina will expose the truth about saturated fats. Does it cause heart disease? Is LDL cholesterol indeed the enemy? And should we be eating fatty red meat and bacon if we want to fix chronic disease? So Nina, my first question. You are a New York Times bestselling author of The Big Fat Surprise, and you have a deep understanding of the dietary guidelines. Do you think that saturated fat, like red meat and butter, causes chronic disease?
I do not think that saturated fat caused chronic disease. Saturated fats are known and thought to cause heart disease, and that has always been the original disease that was pinned on them. And actually, my book, which came out now a decade ago, was the first time that anyone had made a comprehensive argument that we had wrongly vilified these fats, that they do not cause heart disease, and in fact are quite healthy. And so I've been at this for quite a while.
Absolutely. You have dedicated your career in challenging the dietary guidelines and to understand why fat and saturated fat is so important. Let's go into the beliefs versus the evidence, because as you mentioned, there is a lot of belief that red meat causes X, Y, Z. There's three main things. Let's talk about the three main things. So red meat correlating with heart disease. Does red meat cause heart disease?
No, it doesn't. And red meat was originally thought to cause heart disease due to the saturated fat content. So the saturated fat argument came first. That was the original argument that was used to say that foods that contain saturated fat, such as red meat, such as dairy, and coconut oil, that those foods cause heart disease due to their saturated fat content. That argument goes back to the late 1950s, which we can talk about if you want the history there. But really, the very first time that we thought those foods were bad for us was when the American Heart Association came out with a advisory in 1961 saying avoiding saturated fat was the best measure of prevention against heart disease. So that is really when it all began. For red meat specifically, then there came another of other arguments. There's the idea that red meat contains heme iron, which was thought to cause heart disease. There was another metabolite called TMAO. And red meat has been correlated in a number of studies, what are called observational studies, that show an association between red meat and heart disease. So this is a very low quality, weak type of data because it shows association and not cause and effect relationships, right? So only a clinical trial can show that one thing causes another thing. Otherwise, you're stuck with these kinds of weak studies that show only association. We could talk an hour about the weaknesses in those studies, but one of them specifically related to red meat is that when they're doing these what's called food frequency questionnaires, they're asking people what they eat. And by the way, people lie about what they eat. And that's one of the problems with these studies. But they are putting red meat, they're asking people, do you eat hamburgers? That's counted as red meat. And they do not have the ability to separate out the meat in the hamburgers from the French fries that are eaten with them, the milkshakes that are eaten with them, the buns that are eaten with them. So those studies are problematic due to the confounding, that is, all the other factors that come with red meat for people who eat red meat. Not to mention that the people who are eating red meat over the last 50 years are the people who are generally less healthy because they are ignoring their doctor's advice, right? They're all doctors, nutritionists, dietitians are telling people to avoid red meat. If you're one of the people ignoring that advice, that often means, and this has been found and confirmed in studies, that you're more likely to smoke, you're less likely to exercise, you're more likely to be drinking alcohol, you're more likely to be engaging in all kinds of other unhealthy behaviors, nothing to do with your red meat eating, that are likely to be causing or creating this association with heart disease.
So if somebody's watching this and they go see their doctor and they say, I'm on a ketogenic diet, a heavy red meat diet, the doctor says, stop doing that straight away. What advice would you give to that person watching?
First, let me say that this idea that red meat is bad for our health is so deeply ingrained in our thinking. And there has been so much media about it. I might say propaganda about it. There are many forces that are converging to try to make us eat less red meat. But one of the things that a doctor may respond to is that the most rigorous systematic reviews, that's where they look at all the data on a specific food or really any kind of intervention and outcomes reviewed in the most rigorous way using, I won't get into the methodology, but there was a series of these papers that came out in, I think it's 2018. We can put that in your show notes, hopefully, in a very top journal called the Annals of Internal Medicine. And they looked at all the evidence on red and processed meats, and they looked at outcomes on cancer, heart disease, and what they call cardiometabolic outcomes. But those really are the outcomes that are linked to both both diabetes and heart disease. Um, and what they found overall was the evidence was minimal, of very low quality. So mostly these kinds of associational studies, and it was all of there was so little evidence on this that really they couldn't say anything about whether red and processed meat caused any of these diseases. So their ultimate conclusion was eat the amount of red meat that you like because we do not have evidence to tell you anything to the contrary. So a good doctor should be able to recognize high quality journal, top quality systematic reviews, and should be able to understand that this is really a comprehensive look at the overall evidence.
Or I will ask you for the link for that evidence and I'll pop it into the show notes so that people can have that as a body of evidence to present to their doctor in case that situation happens. Now, another thing that people believe about red meat and saturated fat is that it's going to cause cancer. Now, this came from the World Health Organization, specifically the IARC decision, mandating that meat or processed meat is carcinogenic, meaning it causes cancer. Is that true?
I looked at, first of all, no, the answer to that is no, but um, uh, so I did a very deep dive into that decision, which I believe was in 2015. I interviewed people on the panel. I went and looked at all of their science, and it was red and processed meats with specifically colorectal cancer. So it wasn't all cancer, it was just colorectal cancer. What I found was quite shocking. First of all, I think it was about 85% of the panel members had been publishing papers their entire lives, 20 to 30 years, trying to show that red meat caused cancer. So this was a very, I would say, biased group. they came in with a preconception that red meat caused cancer. This is what they had been trying to show, I would say unsuccessfully, that red meat causes cancer. Now they're dominating this expert committee. And there were, just to give you a couple of examples of how that process was flawed, there are actually clinical trials on red meat and cancer. So clinical trials, again, the kind of evidence, rigorous evidence that can show cause and effect relationships. If you look at the pyramid of evidence, they're right at the almost, the tippy top of that pyramid, meaning they're the most rigorous, reliable kind of data that you can use. There were 2 trials, tested red meat. One of them is NIH. Actually, they were both NIH funded. Those trials showed that high red meat diets did not cause cancer. That's the most rigorous kind of research. Those clinical trials were not allowed to be presented as evidence in this meeting that took place in France. And in fact, the members of the committee that tried to present that evidence were shouted down by the chair of the committee. So um, that was maybe not the most scientific process. It was, I think it's fair to say, biased from the start. And ultimately, what they came out with, even with their bias, was that the association they found between red and processed meat, again, association, a weak form of evidence, was only, there's something called a relative risk that measures the strength of association. That was 1.17 for red meat and 1.18 for processed meat. I just want you to understand 1 means no association. So 1.17, 1.18, these are tiny, tiny associations. And it is generally viewed by people in the epidemiological community. Those are the people who do these observational studies. In this community, outside of nutrition is sort of accepts these very, very low relative risks. But outside of nutrition, they generally will not look at a relative risk below 2 or 3 because they think below that, there's just too much of this confounding, which I described a little bit earlier. So these are incredibly low relative risks that are likely due to confounding and are generally not accepted in the larger epidemiological community. So I think that evidence really does not show even associations between red and processed meats and cancer. And again, the more rigorous clinical trial evidence did not confirm that.
Absolutely. It's important for people to understand confounding variables and association data, which is not enough data to have a proven effect on something. For example, we can show that sugar causes diabetes based on a high level of evidence. But when it comes to saturated fat causing heart disease, it's observational, correlational data. It's not actually high quality, like randomized control studies. So that is very important to understand. So moving on, red meat does not cause heart disease. Red meat does not cause cancer. They say that red meat and saturated fat makes you fat. Is that true?
Um, Also not true. Again, in these Annals of Internal Medicine reviews, one of these cardiometabolic outcomes they looked at would indicate, those are indicators of what we call insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is thought to be the root cause of these diseases, including obesity. No effect of red meat on insulin resistance. So, uh, let's take red meat and saturated fats separately. What we think that causes obesity is the amount of glucose and fructose that you're eating. So roughly the sugar that you're eating. There's and there's the glucose that goes into your body and is taken up by insulin, which puts the glucose away in the fat cells. The fructose goes and dysregulates the liver. There is no glucose in red meat. There is no glucose in red meat. So it is almost impossible for red meat. It is impossible for red meat to drive obesity. And again, I think that comes down to correlational studies. I actually haven't seen claims of red meat causing obesity because I think that's so absurd. It really is the sugar and starches in your body that are driving obesity. And the same is true of saturated fat. Saturated fat does not contain glucose. No fat contains glucose. And even though fat has a higher number of calories per gram, so that is why it was originally thought to be obesogenic back in the 60s and 70s. They thought, well, it's dense in calories. Therefore, it must lead to obesity. That had never been proven, and it has still not been proven that without glucose, which is the provocateur of the fat storage hormone insulin, you really cannot get fat on fat alone.
I've seen hundreds, if not, I think 200 or 300 people lose fat, visceral fat, on a high fat ketogenic diet. So, increasing their fat, moderate protein, and dropping their carbs. So, when people say that perhaps fat makes you fat, it could be that they're adding in other things or doing something else that might be causing the obesity or high insulin levels. And I also want to talk about cholesterol because people will think, well, what about my cholesterol when I eat more fat? Before that, I want to ask you about you, Nina, because you were a former vegetarian for over 2 decades. How did you change your mind about red meat and also saturated fat?
Well, when I started, it took me 9 years to write my book, and I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of experts all over the world, and I read many, many thousands of papers and books, and I did a huge amount of research. When I started, I was indeed avoiding red meat, avoiding butter. I was largely a vegetarian, and I thought that was a healthy way of eating. I also was maybe 20 pounds heavier than I am now, but I always thought it was my fault. I wasn't trying hard enough, and despite my cooking everything at home and making my own bread, I just thought needed to move more, eat less. And as I gradually came to understand the science and really the lack of science behind most of our commonly held beliefs around nutrition, and the reason it took me 9 years was I really had to convince myself because it is so counterintuitive to everything that we've been told, right? Avoid fat. Don't eat fat if you don't want to get fat is a principal one. That all of your dieting efforts should be focused on counting your calories, and it was really just a matter of calories. That's another one. That these foods, somehow we've received the wisdom that we should not be having full fat dairy. We should definitely not be eating red meat. We should stick to lean proteins. These are things that were so deeply embedded in my psyche and consciousness. It took me so long to truly convince myself otherwise. But at the end of all that time, checking and rechecking my work, and I just came to the belief that I had truly been wrong, embarrassing as that was. And so, by 2014, I bought my first piece of red meat from the supermarket and brought it home and put it on the counter. I wrote a whole essay about this that was published in a woman's magazine about how alien it was to me, how difficult it was to see that big, raw, red piece of meat on my counter and how challenging it was to cook. And, it is a cultural, there is an inhibition almost at a cultural and really even at a moral level that we have against eating red meat. I think I've heard this from other people too. I had that very powerfully. It took me a long time. And then, of course, I had spent you know, my my entire adulthood chopping vegetables, like roasting them, preparing vegetarian meals, hand making my pizza crusts, everything. And it took me a long time then to learn how to cook this new way of eating, really, which was learning how to not burn steak. I think that took me a year to learn how to not make a terrible steak.
Apparently, burning steak is not good, and you don't want to have your meat overly charred. So, you do want to have lightly seared meat and keep it nice and juicy. So, let's dive into understanding where all this came from, which is understanding why red meat and saturated fat was demonized. It comes from the dietary guidelines and also the food pyramid.
Well, actually, it starts before then. I mean, the real history goes back to the 1950s. And just to paint the picture for folks, in the 1950s, we were experiencing in America the rising tide of heart disease, which had been practically non existent in the early 1900s. It was known, it had been identified and described in textbooks, but it was rarely seen in hospitals. It was just not, the rates were very, very low. In the 1920s and 30s, it started to rise. Nobody knew why. By the 1950s, it was the number one killer of Americans, particularly middle aged men. And it was astonishing, shocking, and terrifying to people to be living with this epidemic of heart disease and not understanding what caused it. There were a number of theories about what caused heart disease. One was that it was vitamin deficiency. Another was that it was the rising tide of auto exhaust in the air due to the ever increasing amount of cars. There was the theory that it was the type A personality, men at work in the office running around screaming at people and all of a sudden having a heart attack. And then there was a theory called the diet heart hypothesis proposed by a scientist named Ansel Keys, who many of your listeners may have heard of. But I think I had in my book, I did maybe the deepest dive on his work that anybody's ever done on his, he, not just his science, but him as a personality, right? He was a very ambitious, aggressive scientist. He believed that he was wrong until proven, sorry, he believed that he was right until proven wrong, which is really the opposite of the way that scientists are supposed to think. They're supposed to try to disprove their own beliefs. He believed the opposite, which was he was right. He would argue anyone to the death. He was considered something of a bully by his colleagues. And he, based on very, very little science, he was able to get himself onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association. That was the group, the premier group in the nation for telling people what caused heart disease. He got on there in 1960. In 1961, he was able to get them to make this recommendation to tell people to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol, replace it with seed oils, what we now understand as seed oils, as the best measure of prevention against heart disease. That was the very first recommendation anywhere in the world telling people to avoid these nutrients as a way to protect themselves against heart disease. That was really the beginning. That was the tiny little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today on saturated fat. So at the time, there was almost no evidence for it. Some tiny, tiny clinical little trials on humans that he had done. Um, and and part of the story that is super interesting is that in the 60s and 70s, so after the American Heart Association comes out with this this policy recommendation, the reason I say advertisement is that that stamp of approval by the American Heart Association, it medicalized this whole subject. So all of a sudden, seed oils or vegetable oils as they were known then, so we're talking soybean, safflower, cottonseed, corn oil, they started to be medical products and they were advertised in magazines and women's magazines and all kinds of magazines. A picture of Mazola oil, which was a popular oil at the time, saying, take this ad to your doctor and have them prescribe this oil to protect yourself against heart disease. So these became medical products. That was a huge boost to the seed oil industry. And this was also the beginning of making our diet something that had been the subject of home cooking, of our, the recipes from our mothers and our grandmothers. That became now medicalized and outsourced to a doctor's office. So our diet was something that we would get from a prescription pad from a doctor's office. So it was no longer ours, really. It was no longer part of our culture. It came to us from a doctor. So this is how it started through the American Heart Association. And then you're right to say the dietary guidelines, which came out in 1980 in the United States, so that was 20 years later, they adopted the entire American Heart Association platform. So the very first guidelines in 1980 said, keep saturated fat low, keep dietary cholesterol low. And at that time also, there was this idea that we should just keep all fat low. So the low fat diet, that was the central plank of these dietary guidelines to begin with. And I don't think people understand, having the whole weight of the federal government behind a policy had a huge impact. It was in that very year that all cattle started to be bred to be leaner, that we started to reduce red meat and swap it for chicken, lean meat, that we started to reduce our consumption of whole milk, butter, eggs, all of those we cut back on. And instead, we increased grains went up dramatically, fruits, vegetables. I mean, we've complied with these dietary guidelines in every category of food that has been measured by the government. And that is also the year the dietary guidelines were, obesity is going along at like 12, 13% of the population in the United States amongst adults. And the dietary guidelines come along in 1980, and you see a sharp uptick in obesity rates, which has continued like that virtually ever since. So the dietary guidelines had a huge impact on our country. In terms of all diseases, but it was this radical shift in diet that the guidelines proposed for us that caused all of that.
As Nina mentions, the changes in the dietary guidelines going high carb and low fat has led to this massive escalation in chronic disease. But the good news is you can take control of your health in a very easy way. Simply drop the carbs or go zero carb while also increasing your healthy saturated fats. Now, this is the ultimate low insulin state. And remember, low insulin, that's where you fix chronic disease. And with a zero carb to a carnivore diet, I have seen so many people experience incredible results. I've seen people lose 100 or even 200 pounds and even reverse chronic conditions that their doctor would say you'll never be able to reverse. Things like heart failure. I've even had somebody that has improved their multiple sclerosis on a carnivore diet. And I experienced this myself when I went carnivore 5 years ago. And what I found helped me and my community stay on track was support through medical doctors. And that is why I created Go Carnivore, a private online community where you can ask all of your burning questions to our team of carnivore doctors, including the ones that you see on this podcast. One of the best things about the community are our monthly challenges, our high fat challenge and our dairy free challenge. This is where our members get incredible results. So if you want to try carnivore with medical support, just head to gocarnivore.com and get 10% off your first month of membership. And how does it affect real world? So say, for example, school lunches, the elderly, the military. When you have these dietary guidelines, they infiltrate to these various areas that people don't have control over. So as an example, my dad is in an aged care facility. So he gets fed, and he has a brain disease, dementia. So he gets fed high carbohydrate, low fat, low meat diet because that is what is propagated as what is healthy. How does that affect people's health, and how do they not have a choice?
So there are two ways in which that happens. One is that the dietary guidelines are considered the gold standard recommendation. So it's a guideline, but it is the gold standard. And if you go outside the guidelines, you might be penalized. So these guidelines are downloaded by all medical professionals, doctors, nutritionists, nurses, dietitians. They're also used by all institutions, such as nursing homes, such as cafeterias in really everywhere. And they are considered the gold standard. And you are considered you potentially are penalized as a doctor, say, working in a large healthcare system for teaching outside the guidelines. I know of quite a number of stories where doctors were taken aside and they were sort of given a talking to. I know doctors who have been fired for teaching low carbohydrate diets. But the guidelines are really de facto. They're more than just guidelines. They're more like mandates, really, to these places, and they fear legal retribution if they do not follow them, if anything goes wrong. The second way that the guidelines affect really almost everybody in America is that they since 1990, they've been mandated by law to be followed by all federal agencies. So that means school lunches, you cannot go outside the guidelines. And that means the military, veterans and hospitals, and in the entire Veterans Administration. It means feeding programs for the elderly, women and infant food programs. That's the WIC program, education programs through SNAP. I mean, it really has this huge impact on all these people who are receiving government food, which is thought to be a quarter of all Americans. So it has a massive impact on not only on what we eat, but what we think is healthy. When you're a kid in school getting this food, you're being taught that is healthy. And you should go look at the PepsiCo or the General Mills site. They have sites on the internet that are just for school lunches, USDA approved school lunch foods that include things like individual servings of Lucky Charms, individual Doritos, Tostitos, uh, you know, chips of all kinds. You can get Fruit Loops. You can get really it's just a huge amount of ultra processed food, what I would call junk food, that is on these websites that is USDA approved. Domino's Pizza has their own special food USDA approved pizza slices that they have. That's another website you can go look up. And really, the only thing is that they use it's pizza with low fat cheese because that's what's approved by the guidelines. So really, in my opinion, even worse for kids. Kids really need dietary fat in there. They need it because for the nutrients that they absorb that are only fat soluble. They need the fat for their brains to grow. They need more fat even than adults do. And so it's really a tragedy what we are teaching and serving our kids.
And who are these members deciding the foods that are allowed on the dietary guidelines or the USDA? Who are these people? Are there some conflicts of interest there?
So there is something called the Dietary Guideline Expert Advisory Committee, and the guidelines are issued every 4 years and have been since 1980 when they started. Every one of those cycles, they appoint a new expert committee that is outside experts in the field. And I had always, I had taken a look at some of these committees and I had seen quite a few conflicts of interest with not only the food companies, but the pharmaceutical companies. When I first naively started doing my research in nutrition health, I thought, why are food scientists, nutrition scientists, getting money from the pharmaceutical industry? What is the link there? And it took me a little while to understand, well, if a pharmaceutical company can get you to endorse their product, say a formula diet or a reliance on some kind of drug, that 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 creates a conflict because the if you're going to take a formula, then that discounts diet, right? I mean, anything that prevents you from seeing a whole foods nutritional approach as the best way to solve disease will get in the way of your understanding. I mean, will be a conflict with pharma. Another example is the person on the most recent dietary committee is Fatima Cody, who's from Harvard. She gets money from the makers of Wegovy and Novo Nordisk, which is the manufacturer of these weight loss drugs. She has been taught, I guess, through her training through Novo Nordisk, or she's being paid to understand that obesity is a genetic disease. And she was on a major TV show saying 60 Minutes saying obesity is a genetic disease. If you have that idea, you don't think diet can do anything, really, because if it's genetics, why bother changing what you're eating? It's in your genes. The first ever systematic review of all the conflicts of interest in a dietary guideline advisory committee was done by a group that I pulled together and my nonprofit funded. That was for the 2020 Dietary Guideline Committee. We found that 95% of that 20-person committee had a conflict, at least one tie with food or pharma, and half of the committee had 30 such ties or more. One member of the committee had 152 ties to food and pharma. So they're really highly conflicted. And I think that's problematic. I mean, I just want to say, I don't know if it's even possible to pull together a group of nutrition scientists with zero conflicts because they pretty much all take money from industry. And that's also because there isn't so much money that comes out of NIH or other public sources to do nutrition research. But what you could do is at least balance the conflicts, right? So, if you're going to have all these people with cereals, say cereal manufacturers who are giving money to some members of the committee, have other members of the committee with conflicts with, say, meat and dairy. Like, just balance off what those conflicts are. So at least there's some range of viewpoints on the committee. I mean, really, the critical problem on these committees is that it is complete groupthink, and there's maybe been one or two people over 40 years who have different viewpoints about nutrition. And we could talk about that a little bit more. I mean, you might wonder, why isn't the low carbohydrate diet been considered in any of these, by any of these committees? And that's because the lack of viewpoint diversity.
Well, I think that if people can attest for themselves and to understand what is the root cause of chronic disease, which we're going to talk about, and fix their diet themselves, because dietary interventions is the number one way to fix chronic disease, whether it's diabetes, insulin resistance, heart disease, obesity. Let's talk about carbohydrates, because that is at the bulk of the food pyramid. The dietary guidelines, the USDA, says to eat 6+ servings of carbohydrates, grains, and stuff a day. Do you think that carbohydrates is healthy for you for a metabolically inflexible person?
That's a very easy answer. No is the answer. And I want to say the dietary guidelines recommend 6+ servings of grains a day, including half of that as refined grains. So they really, those are really terrible recommendations. And in fact, I just came out with a paper recently with a big team of authors where we published the first ever food pyramid, peer-reviewed food pyramid for people with combating metabolic diseases, and it's a low carbohydrate food pyramid. So that's something else that people can take to their doctor to show that's in a peer-reviewed paper. It wasn't easy to get that through, but if you have a metabolic condition, it can also be characterized as a condition of carbohydrate intolerance. In the same way people get gluten intolerance, they develop intolerance to carbohydrates. What does that mean? It means that your body really cannot process the amount of glucose coming into the body, right? So carbohydrates are made up of glucose and fructose, and even something like healthy whole grain bread, which you think would be better for you, it's still, the moment that you eat it, those starches are just sugar molecules holding hands. They come apart immediately. It's just like, from your body's perspective, it's just like eating a slice of white bread. And that glucose enters your body. Insulin is released from pancreas to deal with the glucose. You can only have about a teaspoon of glucose circulating in your blood at any one time, and it has to get rid of that glucose. So what does it do? It puts it in the bodily tissue. It first, in a healthy person, it'll put that away in your muscles. Your muscles will get a bit of glucose. It might make you want to burn it off, or it puts it in your other bodily tissues. And then it starts socking it away in your fat cells. And everybody's different, right? So some people get fatter more quickly than others. In India, we have many people with diabetes who aren't fat, but that's the way that their insulin distributes their glucose. Eventually, it goes into the fat cells, and you need more and more insulin as time goes on with the chronic consumption of carbohydrates. You may be having oatmeal for breakfast and fruit as a snack, and then you have a grain salad, and then you have pasta for dinner, and then you're snacking on um, what you think is healthy. It's fruit, but also contains sugar. Over time, the amount of insulin needs to be increased to deal with the glucose that is coming into your body. At some point, you develop what we call insulin resistance. Hyperinsulinemia is another word for it, but that's when your insulin is really high and it cannot deal with the incoming glucose. So in some cases, the glucose then spills over into the urine, and that is a type 2 diabetes, right? In other cases, people just get hugely overweight and fat. And so, and it also leads to worsening of your blood lipids, which is indicators of heart disease. I mean, really, we believe that many of these chronic diseases that we suffer from are all tied back to this insulin resistance. But I think this has been really well documented. And to me, the most convincing evidence is that there have now been, I would say, hundreds of clinical trials, again, that rigorous form of evidence showing that if you reduce total carbohydrates, and it's really total carbohydrates that is shown to have these results, we may find out other aspects of carbohydrates down the line, but this is the state of the evidence today. Reducing your total carbohydrate load will reverse these diseases, right? So even if you bring it down to what's relatively, what I think is fairly high amount of carbohydrates, like 100 grams a day, you will see many people see improvements in their lipid profiles. They will lose weight. If you bring it down to 50 grams, those improvements will happen more rapidly, more dramatically. There are additional effects that happens if your body actually enters into a state of what we call ketogenesis, where you start shifting your whole fuel source from glucose over to ketone bodies. That has additional benefits, it seems, for the brain especially. But I mean, that is data that comes from randomized controlled clinical trials, and it's quite powerful, and it's an abundant amount of data. And so to me, that's the most powerful evidence really that exists on diet and health, period, right now.
Absolutely. So if somebody's metabolically inflexible, because I'm trying to highlight that because I see a lot of people saying, well, I eat carbs and I have a high carb, high sugar diet and I'm fantastic. It's in the context of somebody has elevated insulin. So whole wheat bread, honey, fruit, oatmeal are equal to sugar because they break down as sugar. So they're all the same thing, glucose in the body. I have a question about the sugar diet. Do you think that is healthy for people if they want to get metabolically flexible and lose weight?
No, I mean, I haven't really followed that very closely, but I find it fascinating that people are promoting a sugar diet. I want to say one thing that you brought up that is super important, which is that if you are a healthy, metabolically flexible person, and what we mean by that is that you are still insulin sensitive. You can deal with the carbohydrates coming in your body, and that means you can eat carbohydrates quite just fine. I mean, it's not harming you. You're okay, and that's why we have populations, say, when people always point to the Japanese eating rice, they were metabolically flexible when they're, and they may have different genetic predisposition to carbohydrates. I mean, different populations do have different tolerances of carbohydrates. So in that context of being metabolically flexible, you can eat carbohydrates. I do not think there's any data to support that a high sugar diet or an all sugar diet over time can possibly lead to weight loss or metabolic improvement over time, because we know what happens when the glucose, and we haven't talked about fructose, but fructose is part of sugar when it comes into your body and the damage that it does. And it's very well established. It is possible that if you have a very low calorie diet of just sugar, you can stay relatively healthy, because that is also a low carb diet. If you keep the calories low enough, you are also eating a low carbohydrate diet. So the total amount of carbohydrates coming in your body, even though there's sugar, is not having such a damaging effect. But I would like to follow those people over a year and see what happens to them. I mean, first of all, you can't keep calories low for that amount of time. The precursor to the sugar diet was something called the rice diet, where they had to put people in, they could only do it in hospital setting, and they had to strap people down to their beds to keep them from eating more than the, what was it, 800 calories a day or something that they were allowed to eat. That's the only way that people can sustain a super low calorie diet like that. They can't do it in natural conditions. I mean, hunger just drives yourself back, and it will lead you to eat more.
I've just heard a lot of people ask about the sugar diet, and there's YouTube videos about the sugar diet, people saying they've lost weight, they've improved their blood sugars. But let's talk about the most evidence based diet to actually fix chronic disease and become metabolically flexible. What is the number one evidence based approach to fix chronic disease?
I think that it's no question that that is a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. When you just look at the clinical trial literature, which is, you can search on pubmed.gov. It's a government website. You click the clinical trial button, see, search Atkins, low carbohydrate, ketogenic. You will come out with thousands of studies. And I'm actually putting together a website right now where we list like all of those studies. There are various databases that include them. Let me just go through the other diets so people can understand a comparison. The only other diet for which there is as much or just almost as much clinical trial data is the Mediterranean diet, right? That is lauded as a very healthy diet. But if you look at systematic reviews, again, this kind of rigorous process of reviewing all the evidence, the low carbohydrate diet outperforms a Mediterranean diet on glycemic control, that's control of your blood sugar, on weight loss, uh, heart disease risk factors. It depends which one you choose. There's debate over that, but low carbohydrate consistently raises your HDL cholesterol. That's your good cholesterol going up, and it consistently does better on lowering triglycerides, which are the fatty acids in your body. I think those are the two most important indicators of heart disease risk. So Low carb outperforms the Mediterranean diet in the vast majority of systematic reviews. What about the low fat diet? Because that was the diet mandated by the government for a very long time. There are a large number of clinical trials on the low fat diet, and they all show no benefit. So that diet has been studied and it shows no benefit. I mean, I'm talking a clinical trial on 49,000 women called the Women's Health Initiative, where they successfully reduced fat, they reduced meat, they increased fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. No effect for protecting against any kind of cancer, which it was powered for. No effect on heart disease, no ability to prevent type 2 diabetes. And those women, after 8 years, weighed only 2 pounds less than the control group. And that is just one. There's 4 or 5 other NIH-funded trials on the low-fat diet. So we can say the low-fat diet has been studied, but it doesn't show any benefit. I could go on. I mean, the vegan vegetarian diet has been studied, but only in a few clinical trials, and they have, I would say, conflicting results. The very famous Dean Ornish study showed that 2 people on the Ornish intervention died, and HDL consistently came down, triglycerides went up compared to the controls. So that, even though that is a diet that's famed for bringing down your bad cholesterol and therefore saving people from heart disease, and it showed apparently reductions in scans, but 2 people died on his diet versus 0 of the controls. And so to me, that's not a very reassuring trial. So very, very little evidence on vegetarian and vegan diets promoting good health. Um, and then, there's a bunch of other diets with brand names, but they almost never have any clinical trials behind them. Or if they do, they're funded by the company that created the brand, which is a conflict of interest. So I think there's just no question that the vast majority of most rigorous evidence supports low carbohydrate ketogenic diet.
Now, as Nina mentions, the most rigorous evidence to fix chronic disease is a low carb ketogenic diet. And later in the episode, Nina will discuss exactly what you need to eat, including the best fats. Now, while what we eat is very important, what we put in our skin also matters. And in case you don't know, I have followed a high fat carnivore lifestyle for the past few years, and it has helped me fix so many different health conditions. But that got me thinking about what I put on my skin. You see, I've changed up my skincare routine a lot in the past few months, as I generally have very sensitive, acne prone skin. And I used to use 10 different skincare products, but now I only use one. It's 100% grass fed tallow, which is chemical free. Now, you might be thinking, why would you put tallow on your skin? Well, this has helped my skin so much. It has improved the skin texture and hydration. And I have loved this product so much. That is why I created the Primal Tallow Balms, and I'm very excited to share that with you. The Primal Tallow Balms are handcrafted with 100% grass-fed, grass-finished tallow, which naturally contains vitamins A, D, E, and K2. One of the best things is that it has no nasties, no preservatives, just pure tallow. And right now, the Primal is offering my viewers 40% discount store-wide for the next 7 days. So if you'd like to pick up a tallow balm, just head to theprimal.com/discount. There's also a link in the description. So with respect to a low-carb ketogenic diet, what specific diseases are these clinical trials in? So if somebody has insulin resistance, diabetes, can they say, oh my God, there's evidence to show reversal?
That's a very good question. I would say the best evidence shows that a ketogenic diet, in combination with some kind of support from an app where you have constant continual support from your healthcare practitioner, that reverses type 2 diabetes. So the greatest number of clinical trials unequivocally show that a ketogenic diet is the very best for improving glycemic control, lowering insulin levels, lowering your average blood sugar, reversing a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. That is the best quality evidence. The evidence on weight loss is that a ketogenic diet nearly always outperforms every other diet for weight loss, but the differences are not enormous. They're not as big as I think that we're seeing in clinical trial practices. Some of the low carbohydrate medical practices have audited their patients and show really dramatic weight loss, like 14, 15% of body weight. But the clinical trials don't show a dramatically better weight loss on ketogenic. I think there's an interesting reasons for that, but it always outperforms any other diet. Let's say that. And there is good evidence to show that the ketogenic diet improves the vast majority of cardiovascular risk factors. So in 22 risk factors that were measured in a large controlled clinical trial, 17 of those improved. Markers of inflammation, HDL, triglycerides. 2 did not change, and I think 1 or 2 got worse. And the problem is the one that gets worse is LDL cholesterol, which is what so many people fixate on, exclusively on LDL cholesterol, which I believe is problematic because you really have to look at it in this larger picture, which is if 17 out of 22 risk factors are all getting better and one is going in the other direction, should we just treat for that one, or should we look at this? I mean, obviously, I think we should argue for looking at that bigger picture. Okay, what other diseases? There's a number of clinical trials. Now we're getting into the realm where I think the evidence is more preliminary. Some clinical trials, but not large numbers of them. So reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now called MAFLD, really quickly, like within weeks, reversing that disease by just lowering carbohydrates. PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, can be reversed by a ketogenic diet. Let's see, mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, some amazing data there that has started to come out. Not large randomized controlled clinical trials yet, but the data that has come out in observational studies and small trials is just astonishing, especially because these are diseases we thought were incurable and could not ever be reversed. What am I forgetting? Oh, kidney disease is another one with very promising results. And maybe there's others that you remember. I mean, I know anecdotally, it's just phenomenal what I see reported anecdotally, but that's not a high quality evidence. So, I don't want to go into that realm, but there's a lot that's happening anecdotally. Oh, the other one that I think is there's maybe a case study that's come out is on IBD. I think it's an irritable bowel disease, or I'm getting that name quite a little bit wrong, but that, and there's another study showing that a no fiber diet was the most effective for reversing symptoms of IBD. Again, these need to be replicated. This is not robust data, but I think it's interesting and provocative.
Absolutely. I've got a carnivore and keto group, and I've got people on there that have reversed heart failure, fixed diabetes, lost weight, even though you said maybe people don't lose that much weight. That's another thing that people ask, why don't I lose weight on this diet? But there's so many success stories that are anecdotal of people reversing chronic disease. I want to talk about cholesterol as association with saturated fat. Now, when somebody eats more fat, they're going to see maybe their LDL cholesterol increases. So my question for you is there a connection between dietary cholesterol, the fat that you eat, and blood cholesterol?
I can answer that as a robust no. And that is because the cholesterol, your body has a homeostatic mechanism for maintaining the amount of cholesterol in its body. And that's called a homeostatic mechanism. The same way that you keep your body at a steady temperature, you keep the cholesterol in your body at a steady level. Cholesterol is absolutely essential for every function in your body. I mean, none of your systems would work if it weren't for cholesterol. So the body has to know how to make its own. When you eat a lot of cholesterol, your body downregulates its own production and vice versa. So the reason that I know that this is absolutely true is that even the folks who were pushing caps on dietary cholesterol, let's say the dietary guidelines, their own expert committees and the expert committee at the American Heart Association, when they reviewed the evidence, they reluctantly dropped their caps on cholesterol. The American Heart Association did it in 2013, dietary guidelines in 2015, and they did that reluctantly. You really have to search to find that information because these are experts who would rather not be wrong. But even in their own words, they had to acknowledge that their reviews showed no relationship no relationship between the amount of cholesterol that you eat and the amount of cholesterol in your blood. So no relationship found.
And if somebody does a high fat diet or a ketogenic diet and their LDL cholesterol increases, the doctor wants to put them on a statin, what is your advice for that person?
Well, I generally do not wade into the statin wars, but I will say that I know that they have serious side effects that are not fully disclosed to people when they decide to go on statins. I have found it very interesting, the data on the neurodegenerative effects on statins. So there's an incredibly interesting trial where people with neurodegenerative problems were taken off statins, and they all showed signs of improvement in all of their neurological functioning. They put them back on statins and they reverted to their previous state. So that's just one study, but I think that's pretty provocative. And people are not told about these side effects when they go on. And they go on statins to reduce their LDL cholesterol. And again, if we go back and think about those 22 risk factors all getting better except for LDL cholesterol, why are we treating just LDL cholesterol? You might think everything else is getting better. So maybe LDL cholesterol maybe I won't risk a statin to treat my LDL cholesterol. The other thing to know is that the level of what's supposedly bad LDL cholesterol has been going down, ratcheting down over the years, ever since we learned about LDL, which is like back in the 80s. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say it was up 150 was considered fine, and now we're supposed to be below 100 and each one of those guideline committees that decides to lower the amount of a healthy LDL cholesterol, I went back and looked at two of those committees in detail, and every single member of those guideline panels had conflicts of interest with pharma. So I'm not fully confident in those numbers. Um, and, I myself would not go on a statin, but I think that that's an individual choice. What I would argue for most is full disclosure of all the side effects. And let's not forget that the trial data on statins has never been opened for public examination. It's always been held by a group in Oxford who refuses to open up that data to other scientists to double check it, to replicate it, to do whatever. That's an enormous problem, right? I mean, you're talking about the most widely prescribed drug ever in the history of pharmaceuticals, and we should have access to that original data to have more confidence in it.
Absolutely. It's interesting if you get prescribed a statin, if your life expectancy can increase by 4 days, if you take a statin for 5 years, roughly. What is the point of that? So it's very important to understand the risk versus benefit and to understand cholesterol. The next thing to understand is fats and the fats that we need to eat because they're not all fantastic. What is the best fat that people should be eating?
Well, one thing I want to explain to everyone is that all foods, except for sugar, contain a mixture of fats. So, we feel like, oh, a piece of meat is all saturated fats. But in fact, a piece of tenderloin is about a third saturated fat. And all foods contain a mixture of saturated fatty acids, mono unsaturated fatty acids, mono meaning they have one double bond, which will be important. That's the main kind of fat in olive oil, monounsaturated. And then there are polyunsaturated fats. Poly means many double bonds. And those are what we now call seed oils, but those are sunflower, safflower, soybeans. Soybean is the main seed oil. Really, it's a bean oil that we consume in the United States. So, and we have this idea of good fats versus bad fats. Seed oil is good. We've been told saturated fats are bad. I really believe, and this was, what I presented all the arguments for in my book, which was that we've got that all backwards, that the saturated fats are healthier. And the main reason is that they do not contain these double bonds. Those double bonds, I want everybody to understand, in chemistry, a double bond is between two carbons in these fatty acid chains. Those double bonds, especially under conditions of heat, like a fryer, they open up and they attach to oxygen. And that is oxidation. That's why you take antioxidants, because oxidation is bad for you. It drives inflammation. That is why these oils are dangerous, not just when heated, but this oxidation can occur just in conditions of, sitting on your kitchen counter over time. Your oil will go rancid, as will your nuts and seeds, which contain these polyunsaturated fats, right? Saturated fats The saturated refers to the fact that all the the bonds are saturated with hydrogen. Sorry. So that just means no double bonds. No double bonds, no opportunity for oxidation. That is what makes these fats stable and solid and much safer, I think. I think the oxidation effects are really the main issue with these oils and is why we should avoid them. And that is why saturated fats are so much safer because they do not cause oxidation, therefore do not drive inflammation. And it's not just inflammation, it's the oxidation products and then the second tier, what is called perioxidation products that are produced by these cascades of oxidation that are going on in the oils. And you consume all these oxidation and perioxidation products, some of which are known toxins, right? Acrolein, that's the toxin in cigarettes. Aldehydes, that is another known toxin. So, and there are hundreds of these perioxidation products. So you do not want that in your body. And that is why saturated fats are better to cook with, better to eat. And what I'm talking about here, just to be very clear, butter, ghee, coconut oil, tallow, lard, duck fat, chicken schmaltz, chicken fat. I mean, those are the fats that we consumed and ate uniquely until seed oils were invented in 1911. So let's just be clear. That's what humans survived on. That's what we evolved to eat. That's what our bodies know how to absorb and process. But I also want to be clear, these other fats, monounsaturated fats and a certain amount of polyunsaturated fats do occur naturally in foods and they're fine. I think, especially in the context of food, they are not problematic. I definitely think they're healthy. And I think olive oil is healthy as well. That one double bond means there's some oxidation, but I think olive oil is just fine for in non-heated applications, right? So salad dressings, any kind of cold sauce, that's when I would use olive oil.
So it's best to cook in animal fat, so butter, ghee, lard, tallow.
Avocado oil, which is a relatively new product, that has about the fatty acid profile of olive oil. So I would put that in the olive oil category.
Okay, question about bacon. Do you think bacon is healthy for you?
I do.
Why is it so good?
Well, I don't know. Do you know that bacon is the number one food that causes people to go off their vegan or vegetarian diets? I mean, there's something so delicious about bacon, but that's not why it's good for you. It's just not bad for you. It contains a healthy mixture of fatty acids. It's definitely better if it comes from, let's say, non-industrially produced animals, because the ones that are the fat content of the bacon depends a lot on the feed that it's given. So it can get high in these polyunsaturated fats that we're trying to avoid. But, high quality bacon is a really nice proportion of fat to protein. So it's really an ideal ketogenic food because it's about 75% fat and 25% protein.
So if somebody was to eat more bacon and butter, do you think that's going to help reverse their chronic disease?
I do. I mean, it's not just me thinking that. I mean, it's just like that is what I think the clinical trial literature shows, that if you can consume about 15-20% protein, 75% of your calories is fat, as few carbohydrates as possible, that is what reverses disease in clinical trials.
Absolutely. And when you say those macros, some people might be thinking, well, how do I calculate those macros? But if you eat foods like fatty red meat, if you eat bacon, if you eat wild caught salmon, if you eat eggs, all these things naturally have the fats and the proteins and lowering the carbs. So people don't have to calculate the macros.
Sorry, I just want to hop onto that point there, which is that one of the things that's very liberating about a ketogenic diet is that you do not have to not only not calculate macros, you do not have to count calories. I mean, in these clinical trials, they are not calorie restricted. And that means you just eat to satiation. And that is not just a matter of diet protocol. That is like a profound change. I think it's almost like a spiritual change that people experience. I mean, maybe that's too high-minded to put it that way, but most of us who've been dieters our whole lives have gone through years not trusting our bodies, hating our bodies even, and not, thinking about all day long about how many calories have I had, how many more am I allotted, where am I going to get them, and I'm still hungry. Once you are liberated from that, it really restores a huge amount of your own energy to actually live your life, right? Not to be thinking about food all the time is a tremendous liberation. So I feel like that is maybe one of the most profound things about this diet, which is like food is no longer an issue. I mean, you can still enjoy it, you can cook wonderful meals, but if you don't want to think about it all day, and if you do not want to torture yourself, and you certainly don't want to hate your body, it's a really nice lifestyle. And I think it keeps you healthy. And that's what I think the data shows.
It's called food freedom. And when I did a ketogenic diet, that gave me the ultimate food freedom, as with so many other people. Question about fiber. Do you think fiber is important for optimal health?
I do not. And I already talked about this one clinical trial where it was very surprising to the investigators, but they allowed everybody to go on a no. These are all people with bowel problems, and they allowed everybody. And that's why people consume fiber, because they think it's important for your digestion. These people had crippling bowel disease. They all went on a no fiber diet, and then they all resolved their symptoms. And then most of those people chose to stay on that diet forever. And the people who didn't choose it went back to their old diet, and it was mainly for reasons like they had animal rights issues, or they were ideological vegans and they didn't want to follow that diet, not because they didn't feel better, but because there were other reasons. If you look at the data on fiber and heart disease in high-level systematic reviews, there's really no relation. There's no relationship between high fiber diets and prevention of heart disease. I do not think that there's rigorous data to show that fiber is important for preventing either of those conditions. So personally, I believe that fiber was created as an essential macronutrient. We were told it's essential macronutrient. When I go back and read all those studies, they're all funded by the cereal industry. So I really wonder if there was not some drive by the food industry to try to get us to believe that to eat cereal or other grains, because we were now being told that fiber was an essential part of our diet.
Everything that you're talking about is very opposite to what people have heard or may believe. Last question, if somebody has a chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, insulin resistance, and they're just on the fence, high fat, I'm scared, what is your best advice that you'd give to that person?
I think don't fear fat, first of all. Fat does not make you fat, is a really important idea to try to adopt. But I want to say that I think people are different. Some people really need to read science and understand it for themselves, and it takes them a while. And I respect those people. I'm one of those people. And they're not just going to take anybody's word for it. I should mention that I have a PhD in nutrition now. So, I mean, I really have studied this and gone through that process. But I don't think you should trust experts just because they have fancy letters after their names either, because I know a lot of those people in nutrition happen, not to reflect the best science. So I would encourage people to read up on the science, and I can give you some links for people to do that if they want to. There are other people who, let's say they grew up on a farm or they have some experience of eating natural foods. And so for them, it's like a light switch and they just try it and they're happy to just try it. I guess what I would say is give it 4 weeks, see how you feel. Do not neglect to have 2 cups of bouillon every day to deal with the symptoms, the negative symptoms, sometimes called the Atkins flu or the keto flu, that do happen to a lot of people. That can just be a bouillon cube in boiling water. But, do the diet in a serious way. Give it a try. Like, what do you have to lose? And then see how you feel. I mean, I think, like, let people just try. One of the wonderful things about nutrition and health is that we are all an N=1 experiment. And we are not at all the same, right? We do respond to different diets in different ways, but it's not like trying to figure out global warming, which is way beyond anything that any of us can. Like, we can't do our own experiments on that, but we can do an experiment on our own body. See your body as an opportunity to just try out something new, and don't be biased against it.
Nina, thank you so much for your time. If people want to find you more and support your work, where can they find you?
I write a column on Substack called Unsettled Science. So you can find me there, and that's probably the best place. And I am active on social media, mainly on X at Big Fat Surprise is my handle there.
Perfect. All the links are going to be in the description of this episode. Nina, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if you love this episode, watch this one next with Dr. Paul Mason. He'll talk about the easy way to lose weight without counting calories.